Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today's episode is all about mobility and stability. So Ash, what is mobility?
Good question, mate. Mobility is used in a lot of different ways in the fitness industry. Mainly it refers to a range of motion that you can achieve actively. That's probably the most common definition of the term mobility, as opposed to flexibility, which is a range of motion you can achieve passively. So if somebody stretches your hamstring when you're, say, laying on a treatment table, that would be a flexibility passive range of motion, whereas how high you can bring your own leg would be active or more of a mobility assessment. I think as relates to CrossFit, people think of somebody as very mobile if they have really great squat depth, if they are able to get into nice overhead positions. They say they've got a really nice overhead squat and they can find really good alignment in a handstand, anything that requires a decent degree of range of motion. And somebody who lacks mobility is probably the opposite of that, where they lack squat depth and struggle to get into shapes and positions. However, as you touched on in the intro, there is a component of stability here as well, where somebody might present as lacking mobility in terms of range of motion, but actually the thing that's holding back that range of motion could be their stability.
Whoa, there you go. That's a little bit of a spanner. So I just touching on that a bit, I think that's a real common misconception where people, I think they get confused between mobility and flexibility, and they think they're the same thing. So they go, exactly. Oh, okay, I need to be flexible. It's like, no, you don't need to be flexible. You need to take a step back, as we always say, think about what you need to be, say, more flexible for, which most likely you need to be more mobile for, and then how can you do whatever you need to then get more mobile for that task. So exactly. We want to just, I think, making sure this is clear that I think because there are such solid episodes for ourselves where we're talking about what is your function and your why, I think everything we do relates back to that. And that's why that is the foundations, that is your understanding. So then what we want to understand today is kind of, once we have a bit of an understanding of like the why, so we want to get more mobile in that, what can we do? So today's conversation is that's kind of direction we want to start discussing. So where did you want to kick this off?
I think just let's finish off that point on mobility, stability to give it a bit of context, where, our squat is prized as sort of good movement in CrossFit. Somebody's got a really nice deep squat. It's like, oh, they move really well. And obviously you need to hit depth for movement standards if you're going to compete, and training muscles through greater range of motion, you can do more work and get a greater stimulus. So I'm not at all denying that that's something we shouldn't strive towards, as having a nice deep squat. I think just so people aren't left hanging, what situations might you have somebody who can't squat to depth because of stability? So believe it or not, you do get a lot of people who present as very flexible, but still can't squat below parallel. And so what's going on there? So say you've got someone who's a dancer or a yogi who is extremely flexible and can achieve crazy positions, yoga poses and high kicks, and they've got hamstrings for days. Why might it be that they can't squat below parallel? Because all their muscles seem to present as able to lengthen to a great extent. And the reason is it's neuromuscular control. So your body is essentially putting the brakes on because it's not sure how to control a given range of motion. So it's either unskilled or it's so flexible and loose that it's worried about the excess motion that it has and doesn't feel safe going into that range. And I'm sure a few coaches out there can probably relate. They've had somebody who they think is super flexible and they ask them to do a squat and they just don't drop as low as they think, or in certain situations they might have depth, in certain situations they might not. And it's like, this is the same person with the same mobility. I think, why can they squat to depth in this squat but not that squat? And essentially it does come down to that stability and control. So it's also a bit of an explanation for why you might get some guys can't hit depth until they've got 100 kilos on the bar. And the reason is that there's a couple, the weight helps encourage the depth. Obviously it's force driving them down, but also a 100 kilo bar has a lot of inertia. So it takes force to move it, which means even though it's not fixed, it provides stability. So you can brace off that bar and use it as something to like holding onto a rig is another example where you see people who can't squat to depth, but they get their hands on the rig and all of a sudden they can squat all the way to the bottom. Their hips haven't changed in terms of flexibility. You've just given them some stability. So for these people, we need to teach their body to provide the stability for itself that they are getting from the rig or from the heavy barbell. And once they can do that themselves, they will be able to hit that depth unassisted. And I think that's a common misconception that if somebody can't squat low, they just need to keep doing mobility work. And that might mean people interpret it as flexibility work, when in certain situations like this, that might be the worst thing for them. If they're already hypermobile, getting even more flexible might make them less stable and actually not help their range of motion, which is what they're going for. So that's the key distinction, is that their goal is range of motion in the squat. Their goal is not mobility for mobility's sake.
No. So just touching on that bit, which you mentioned, because it actually made me think about my own mobility / stability. I've often used weight to essentially improve my positions, shall we say. So me doing a 100 kilo squat would be my active mobility. So I'd use a 100 kilo barbell to put myself into, because I had relatively good positions. So I used, say, a barbell to get myself into better positions. And then that has then in turn carried on to me being able to, say, get to a, say, arse to grass bodyweight squat completely fine. So whereas, to be honest with you, I don't remember far back enough where I wasn't able to do that. So I can't say if there's correlation or causation. But I have definitely, I know there's times where I've used weight to put myself into. So is that a valid tool to use?
Sure. Definitely.
Okay, cool.
So weight is a great way of creating stability. So there's a couple of things going on there. Like we said before, the inertia of the bar provides stability just because it takes force to move it. Like it's harder to wheel a 100 kilo barbell than it is a 60 or a 20. But also there's a phenomenon called co-contraction, which is basically if your body senses instability, it will contract surrounding muscles more to try and control it. So it's like if you step on ice, this is the example Red Bull always like to give. If you step on ice, your steps naturally become very small because your body senses this instability and wants
your bracing is very different as well. You brace a lot because your body's trying to work out, I need to find some stability here. So it's having to use your own body to find that stability, even though it's on an unstable platform. So
exactly right. And this explains why some people find overhead walking lunges easier than body weight or like hands by side lunges, because it's a more unstable movement which forces your body to create more stability for itself. So actually the overall movement becomes more controlled. Whereas if you were to just do a heavy back rack lunge, you actually aren't providing as much stability. So your ankles and hips and core maybe wobble about a little bit more than they would do if you're overhead and forced into tension. So the movement is sloppier and all over the place.
Does this kind of touch on as well then, like doing bilateral and unilateral work? It kind of like, say, a squat compared to a single leg squat. It's in like, well, with using myself as an example again, it's in like my back squat is completely fine. Yet it put me to try and do a pistol and it took me ages, even though I had the strength. It just it comes back to that bit. I didn't have the stability or the neuromuscular like patterning to get myself from A to B. I had to learn that because that was a skill. Essentially, that's it. I just hadn't learned this skill.
Exactly right, yeah. And in a normal back squat, it's a very stable environment. You've got two even feet that can push into each other. You're just going up and down. Whereas as soon as you take that 1 foot off the floor, you're now in an open chain. There's so much more to stabilize in 360 degrees. And because there's so much more to do, if you lack stability, you're really struggling. So yeah, it's I think we touched on it in one of the podcasts before, but something you see in the Valgus episode, you see in barbell athletes is that they can generate huge amounts of force in a very specific situation, but it almost comes to bite them in the ass when they come out of that situation. They now have all this force generation capacity which they can't direct because they haven't trained, naturally they haven't trained in different planes of motion. So when they go out to play five-a-side football, their legs are immensely strong, but they can't control it. They can't control the direction, force generation, and that goes in terms of muscles, but also in terms of joints. They haven't been exposed to those different stimuli, and we'll go a bit Pete Tong.
So for our listeners, if they're trying to work out if they need more mobility or stability, what would be a little test that they could do, or a giveaway for what they would need to do to start working on things?
Yeah, so if we're looking at, say, squat depth, does your squat depth improve when you add stability? So if you hang on to the rig, can you get all the way to the bottom of your squat? Can you get to the bottom of the squat with weight? Like, it's which situations are you struggling with your squat depth? Also have a look at your flexibility. So if you look at all the hip stretches that are widely used, looking at your glutes, your adductors, your hip flexors, how does your flexibility look? And depending on what you find in those little tests are clues as to what's your actual limiter. Because if you can achieve depth with a bit of extra stability, then chances are adding stability will improve your squat depth. If you present as very flexible, then chances are flexibility isn't holding you back, and vice versa. If you're not very flexible and adding stability doesn't help, then you probably do need to stretch and get more mobile to get into the bottom of your squat. And to relate it back to our favorite episode 2, trying to keep things as functional as possible. So if we want to improve our squat depth, trying to do movements that are as close to squatting and stretches that are as close to squatting as possible will carry over best, as opposed to a random yoga pose, which is flexibility in general, but not necessarily very similar to a squat. And this is why, all those challenges of 10 or 30 minutes a day sitting in your squat, you're practicing the squat for extended period of time every day. So the carryover is tremendous. You don't need to do a specific stretch. You just need to be in a squat and do squat-like movements. And all those variations are just opening up your hips in a perfectly specific context. And that is how you get comfortable in the bottom of the squat, is by being in the bottom of the squat.
So I think it's, I know I've seen this before, and I'm pretty sure you have, is where someone has a relatively decent body weight squat, and then as soon as they put a barbell on their back, it turns into pretty much like a fitness model squat, like the half squats, like that, right?
Yeah.
Now, however, you put a kettlebell in their front and they're holding a goblet position, they do a great squat. So then what would be a common diagnosis there, would you say? Like why can they not back squat compared to a goblet squat, and they can hit perfect depth, say, with a goblet squat?
Yeah, so for that specific example, it would be the center of mass, so where is the weight going? So when the weight's in front, it's a lot easier for them to maintain a more upright position. So different muscles are loaded as compared to in the back squat. So their skill, they have skill in the goblet squat, but they don't have the skill of squatting with the back squat to depth. So if that's what they want to work on, we need to get a little bit more specific again. How can we mobilize, or not really the best word, how can we teach them to get to the required depth in a back squat as opposed to a goblet squat? And this is where we come up to the functional continuum and say, right, we need to do some range of motion work with a barbell on our back, because we have the mobility, like the muscles are pliable enough to get to the bottom of a squat. If the weighting is slightly different, now we need to move the weighting one step towards back squat. So maybe we do a front squat instead of the goblet squat to bring the bar a little bit further back in the center of balance. Maybe we use a safety bar, something like that, where we progress towards back squat and bring through the motor control of going all the way to the bottom of a squat, while rather than adding weight as the progression, we move the weight more posteriorly. Then we maybe do high bar back squat, which again is not quite as far behind the center of balance, and finish with a low bar back squat as being the most posterior on the body in terms of loading.
So I think it's making sure you understand that it's more of a, say, patterning issue rather than I just now need to say work on my ankles or my hips. So it's not necessarily a mobility issue. It is just I need to learn the back squat better. And I think this is a common thing. It's like, okay, cool, I can't back squat, but I can front squat. Okay, I'm going to get lifters. Okay, lifters really help you with front squatting, but okay, you can give yourself with the back squat. And then you start, okay, I can't really do that. So it's they're thinking about all these external things that they can add to themselves rather than addressing the key thing, which is I actually need to learn to back squat, and it's because I haven't got that motor control yet. So so what direction do you want to take this? Where do you want to go next?
I think probably what's most useful for people is just evaluating their tools and strategies for mobility. So it's got this aura about it as everybody should do mobility. Like if you're a good exerciser, you're a good athlete, you do your mobility work. And I think what that really means is your warm-ups and look after your movement quality, because mobility is just one component in your movement quality and your mechanics. And for some people, like we've just said, focusing on their stability and motor control is what's going to result in them moving better and achieving more range of motion, which, is what people actually mean when they talk about mobility work. So obviously warm-ups is very important to prepare your body for what you're about to ask it to do. And what are the things you're trying to achieve in your warm-up? You're trying to get the body warm, like increase blood flow. You're trying to prepare your tissues for the ranges of motion they're about to be exposed to. So say you're going to max out your snatch, you need to have got into the bottom of your overhead squat. It shouldn't be the first time you get into the very bottom of your overhead squat is when you hit your max snatch. So it's not just enough to do power snatch in your warm-up. You actually have to have been at the bottom of your overhead squat, so it's not a system shock and your body freaks out that first time you actually hit that position with a lot of weight. So as a general guide, you want to have achieved the final positions you're going to hit in the most intense part of your training, and ideally gone just beyond, or at least to the same extent of range of motion, and wiggled around in those spots, so that when you then access those positions, you feel your body feels ready and it's not a rude awakening, which is the classic. Exactly, yeah. It's like the classic thing of like not warming up, and then you get into an extreme shape and your body hasn't been there today and it freaks out, and that's when everything sort of tightens up and you might get a spasm or something like that. So what's going to allow you to do that? Maybe it's your stability work, maybe it's just light reps of the movement you're about to do. Obviously building up slowly is the classic part of a warm-up. Might be some light stretching, but being aware of what it is for you as an individual athlete that gets you into those shapes. So doing specific stretching, doing your stabilization stuff. So for you, if you want to hang on to the rig to make sure you've got into the bottom of your squat, just so you felt it. All those little things are what you should be doing as your warm-up. And movement prep is a term I prefer to just like generic mobility. If we're looking at stretching specifically, this is another thing that people are a bit confused about quite often, is the difference between stretching styles. So your classic old school static stretching and PNF stretching. They're both ways of increasing your flexibility, but not necessarily your mobility or useful range of motion. So if we get a little bit into the nitty gritty, there are two major mechanisms for that apply to your muscles in stretching. You've got your muscle spindle, which is your stretch reflex, which is what we want to train. This is involved in the stretch shortening cycle. Basically,
this is the spring of the muscle.
Exactly, yeah. It lengthens and then it shortens. And we train that with pulse stretching. So we want to lengthen the muscle and teach it to contract, lengthen the muscle, teach it to contract. And that is how we actually get into a range and return with our own control. And the other one is the Golgi tendon organ. So this operates on tension, and its response is actually relaxation. So when a muscle experiences too much tension, if it feels like something's going to get damaged, it will just relax and switch off. So this is when you squat too heavy, you get to the bottom, you try, and then tension gets too much, and then everything just relaxes and you fail the lift. Yeah, so that's your body defending itself against tearing something. And with long static stretches, that's what you're training. You're training your Golgi tendon organ. You're putting tension on, especially with a PNF stretch. PNF stretching is basically when you stretch and then press into the stretch, then relax, go a little bit further and repeat that. And you can get huge increases in range of motion very quickly from doing it, because you're essentially training the muscle to turn off. And this is where the distinction between passive range of motion and active range of motion become really important, because you'll be able to achieve a huge amount of range of motion, but you're not necessarily teaching how to contract from that range. So if we go back to the squat, you can get very low into your squat, but not actually generate any tension or force. So you're never going to come out. Exactly. So what's the point? Like, that range becomes redundant. So when you're warming up, you don't want to be doing that at all. You don't want to be relaxing your muscles. You don't want to be turning them off. And you do want to be getting a little bounce. You do want to develop tension and control. So not trying to relax and turn off your muscles is key. And this is where I think long static stretches and yoga for CrossFit become confusing, because you feel better, you feel looser, but actually, what's the reason for you doing that? The reason is because you want to have a nice arse to grass strong squat. Then that relaxation isn't actually the stimulus you're trying to train. And what you do want is to be nice and reactive and have tension in that catch position or the bottom position of your squat.
So I guess that kind of links to when I think as an industry, we've all kind of moved on from static stretching before training, and how realizing that isn't the best, say, movement prep for you. And maybe at the end, not necessarily even at the end, because then that's just a slightly later conversation. But if you're training for something in particular, by doing a static movement, are you priming the body ready for the task at hand? And I think that's where I know there's quite a lot of ways of stretching that people like to follow. Like, so yoga, people like to do some yoga. There's ROMWOD, which is like, like the, say, essentially like active yoga, or they like all whatever it is. And it's like, but it's understanding your why to what you're doing it for.
Yeah.
Because I think if you're doing, say, a ROMWOD before you go and train, are you going to be in a mindset ready to train? Because you're then in a completely relaxed state, and then you then have to put yourself, so you've gone from parasympathetic to sympathetic, so you've gone from completely relaxed to completely switched on. So do you really want to do that? And is that going to be beneficial to you in that situation? Whereas if you're doing it as a form of holistic, I like to relax at the end of the day with like a 20-minute shutdown, then that's completely fine. If you're using it for a holistic purpose, not necessarily for a training stimulus to improve upon your session on that day.
Exactly right. Yeah, and I think I want to make that clear that I'm not bashing on yoga. I think it's great. There's a lot of positives to it. I just think it's important to distinguish what role it's playing in your training or in your life, basically. Like, are you doing yoga for relaxation, meditation, and sort of mental well-being? In which case, I think that's awesome and you should do it. But I just don't want people to confuse themselves into thinking they should do yoga because it will benefit their squat depth. It's not that simple. Yeah. And I had a mate get in touch with me a few days ago asking if he should do yoga. And I said, like, why do you think you should do yoga in the first place? And he's like, I just want core strength and flexibility. It's like, well, what are you not flexible enough for? And so I just want to sit on the floor. It's like, well, do you like yoga? It's like, no, I hate it. And I was like, so why would you go through like an hour's class, however often per week, when all you want out of this is to sit on the floor comfortably? Just sit on the floor, get used to sitting on the floor, do some stretches around that, and then you've got what you wanted, and you haven't gone this really indirect path of putting yourself through something you don't enjoy. And it's got that sort of reputation of like, everyone should do this because it's good for you. Like, it's good for you in some ways, but it's not good for everyone in all ways.
Yeah, so I like to use yoga as a form of way to try and completely relax. Like, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, where I'm starting to try and think a little bit more like the health side of the continuum and stuff like that. And stuff. I've given myself some bit more direction on my performance and my steps direction now. But where I am focusing a lot on that, using yoga as a form to get myself into a completely parasympathetic state, so a completely relaxed state where I can focus on my breathing and so forth, which like the cold showers have been doing. All this stuff has been getting into my breathing work, and it's definitely a way where you can focus. I don't like yoga really because I'm bad at it, and what I mean by I'm bad at it is because it's uncomfortable a lot of times to put myself into these positions for long periods of time. Yeah. So what I've been finding though is that's when I'm in like a semi state of, it's partly sympathetic to the point where I'm kind of like, I'm working against it. I'm trying to get myself to a state where I'm relaxing into it. So that's me understanding the control between the two, being able to go from a state of relaxed to a state of ready to go. But that's because I'm not using it to make me better at, say, the overhead squat. I'm using it as a state to work on my, say, well-being.
Yeah, exactly. And that's great. I think it's like, I'm almost the opposite, where I actually enjoy yoga, but don't do it too much because I'm on the more flexible end of the spectrum. And for the things I want to do, so, well, pre-lockdown, I was playing squash, so wanting to be quick and agile and explosive, not being super supple and flexible. Exactly, yeah, you need to be quite, lots of plyometric stuff. And so I don't do too much yoga because I was not hypermobile, but towards that end of the spectrum, and my body feels better being a bit less flexible, which people also find as a strange idea, because there's this thought in fitness that flexibility removes injury risk, and like the more flexible you are, the less likely you are to get injured. And that's just not true. Like, you need enough flexibility to do your function, and anything beyond that isn't necessarily helping you. And go back to that overhead squat example. If you've got full range of motion, you can get arse to grass. Why are you trying to get even more range? Like, what do you stand to gain? Not only is it not a great use of your training time, but you can't get any lower. So why are you continuing to build your flexibility? And the danger here is you have people who like stretching because they're good at stretching. So it's almost like they're ego stroking. Like, I want to be the best at stretching. I want to have the most extreme range of motion. When actually, is that the goal? Is that the end you have in mind? Yeah. No, you want to be good at CrossFit. So get all your positions, maintain your range of motion in those positions, and then get strong in those positions. Don't try to, there's no benefit in, say you've got a great overhead position. If you go if you've got even more shoulder flexibility and that you can lose the bar behind, you're not benefiting by having that laxity in the shoulder. What would be better is to get super strong and stable, building your SOTS press, getting that up in a great position, rather than increasing the range of motion beyond what you need. And I think if you're clear on that, you can redirect your training efforts to have a bit more return on time invested.
I think as I was just thinking about within like you're talking about the range of motion side of things, and then I was thinking of a wall ball in particular, and I asked the grass, and it's like I realized when I actually stopped going arse to grass, one, it was better for my back because I was constantly hitting this position, and I just imagined my joints hitting the bottom position over, and with a wall ball you're doing very high repetitions with a light load, but it's still load. And then as soon as I actually kind of learned to not put the brakes on, but hit depth and use the stretch reflex rather than just hitting a bottom position, my wall ball cycle speed got faster and they were just more efficient because it was, I was still hitting depth, but I wasn't going as low. But I had in my mind, I had to go arse to grass to make sure full range, because that was my squat. And it's like, well, does it need to be in that particular movement? No, I was following the standard of making sure my hips went below my knees. So then that's all I need to do. So anything lower, is that a bonus? Not for that particular, because it actually slows me down.
Exactly.
So
and it's also extra work.
Exactly. So you have to get further out of it. So it's like, it's funny because you do see so many people, like a variety of wall ball variations and stuff. And it's until you actually practice them yourself and put yourselves into these positions, and also go arse to grass and then go say, not like, feel the difference and understand, do I actually need more mobility because I'm not even hitting the movement standard? So do I need to find more range in my hips to get that range? Or do I need to be more stable in that position? Like, what is it that's stopping me hitting a good depth? Or am I going all the way down and I say, I don't have any ability to put the brakes on early, if you know what I mean? Like what I was saying there. So then it's a skill you have to learn. So
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Good, mate. I think that's all I've got to say today.
Yeah, no, mate. I wanted to make sure that, we gave the listeners a real clear understanding of that doing things like yoga and say ROMOD or whatever it might be, that is great if you're using it for an intended purpose to say have a holistic approach to things and a bit more of a mindfulness side of things. And think about when you're going to put that into your training day. If you're going to put yoga, say, into your training day, don't necessarily do some yoga stretches before you're going to go and lift the barbell, because it's not putting you in the right frame of mind to do the task at hand. So utilizing, say, if we're using the squat as the example, so going from a bodyweight squat, holding onto the rig, then to go into, say, a goblet squat with a kettlebell, then maybe doing some empty front squats with an empty barbell, then maybe some back squats, and then start adding weight. It's too often I see people in the gym, whether they're like in class or something, that they go from doing our warm-up that we do prior to lifting to then 60 kilos on the bar and that's their warm-up set. And I'm like, so I've seen some of the strongest people in the world do empty barbell squats, because you're trying to tell the body, this is what I'm doing. So you're creating a pathway, you're creating the movement pattern to switch yourself on, rather than, I need to get to 140 kilos today, so I need to do it in as little steps as possible to get there. That's not the task. You need to think, cool, I want to make as big a jump as possible to not waste energy, but small enough jump as possible so that my body doesn't know the difference. So you're trying to increase volume and weight, say, on the body, without your body going, fuck, that's too heavy. Shit, what am I going to do? And that's when you fold over because you haven't primed the body. So again, understanding the warm-up is, towards your heavy back squat is so important to not disregard it. An empty barbell squat is just as important as, say, your 1 rep max, because without that empty barbell squat moving correctly, you're going to move badly the whole way up. So it's so important. So this is what we wanted the listeners, what we want to get you to get out of this episode today, is to understand the warm up you're doing, is it intended for the task at hand? I think that's the number one thing to take away from this, and that doing all these say these varieties of stretches or whatever, they all have a place, but understand when that place is. And if you don't understand, talk to people, try and find out why, look online, or talk to, you know, Ash or myself, try and get an understanding of what you do for your warm up, and is it the right thing for you? And because obviously we don't know who you are to listen to it, we don't know what your task is that you're working towards, but really make sure that you've got your task specific warm up / movement prep ready, and understand that you're going to do that for what you're about to do.
That's it. And pulse stretches always.
Oh yeah, pulse stretches always. Yeah, pulse stretches always pretty good. So a nice quick one. Well, I say quick one. It was 35 minutes in the end. So, but yeah, guys, thanks a lot for listening. I hope you managed to get something away from today. Just a nice chat, or just about mobility and stability. As always, if you're listening on iTunes, please don't forget to leave us a review. It does help us grow and share the message. And we're on iTunes. Yes, we're on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. So please be sure to find us there, or go on our website, lungeandlift.com, and find out more there. So apart from that, we'll catch you guys in the next episode, and have a great day.
Cheers, guys.